Hi everybody, I'm Miss Knaus. I teach second and third grade at Kenwood, and I'm going to do a read aloud for you for the next few weeks. And the book that I'm reading is actually the book that Kenwood picked for March's reading month this year. It's called Astrotwins Project Blast Off, and it's a chapter book. And we didn't get to finish March's reading month because we went into lockdown and school let out before we got to finish the book. So if you are just joining us for the first time, you're going to love this book. And if you didn't get to finish it during March's reading month, or maybe you want to hear it again, I'm going to be reading all the chapters out loud. I'm going to post them up on YouTube so that you can follow along at your own pace. That means that if you want to listen to one video a night, you can do that. If you want to listen to more than one, you can. If you want to go ahead and listen to the whole book in one sitting, go ahead, I won't stop you. The chapters will be up there ready for you to listen to when you're ready. So Astrotwins Project Blastoff is written by Mark Kelly. And Mark Kelly is an actual astronaut who's been to outer space. And this is a fictional book, which means it's made up, but it has a lot of space science in it. So you can tell that he really knows what he's talking about. If I show you the back cover, there's Mark Kelly. And there he is with his brother, Scott, who's also an astronaut. And so this book is kind of made up about their childhood. There's things in it that could really happen, but there's also things in it that couldn't really happen. This is Emma Jean's copy that I'm reading. Thanks, Emma Jean. Okay. Nice little cover page right there. Chapter 1, July 18th, 1975. This time the twins were determined. Nothing would go wrong. Scott had stationed Major Nelson, the family's big, brown, friendly mutt, at the back door to bark if Mom came home early. Mark had laid newspapers on Dad's basement workbench. They had assembled their tools. And they were absolutely going to follow the advice Grandpa Joe gave them any time you took something apart. Lay the parts down in order so when you put the pieces back together, you can simply reverse the process. Easy. It's just like Grandpa Joe always says, learn from your mistakes, Mark said. Yeah, and since we've made so many, we ought to be geniuses by now, Scott agreed. Mark laughed. Okay, so go ahead. I'll keep everything organized. With a screwdriver made for repairing eyeglasses, Scott removed 2 screws, which Mark placed in the top left corner of the newspaper. Then, the best part, Scott removed the plastic backplate, and the boys got their first look inside Dad's calculator. Cool, they chorused. Exposed, the inside resembled staples, pushpins, and grains of rice, all of them tiny and arrayed around a white plastic rectangle. The biggest piece was the battery, which was easy to recognize and easy to remove. After that, there were 6 more screws. Mark duly put each piece in its place on the newspaper. Should we take out the CPU? Scott asked. Mark knew CPU stood for Central Processing Unit, and that it was made of a material called silicon, and that it was the brains of the calculator. What he didn't know was which piece it was, but no way was he going to admit that to his brother. Sure, he said. Scott used the tip of the screwdriver to pry up the white plastic rectangle, and out it popped. Are you sure you can plug it back in there? Mark asked. You mean, am I sure we can plug it back in there? Scott said. And yeah, of course, I think. And these are transistors, right? He indicated the black spheres that looked like beads. Mark nodded. I guess, but they sure look different than the ones in the TV. Years ago, the boys had watched, fascinated, as the TV repairman worked on their old black and white set. After that, they decided to see what was inside other machines, like the clock radio, the sewing machine, and the lawnmower. Usually they got into trouble, but it was worth it. Scott had just lifted up the calculator to examine the underside of the display when Major Nelson's excited barking made him jump. She's home, he said. She's early, Mark said. She won't come down here, Scott said. Will she? We can't take that chance, Mark said, and in a hurry. We can't take that chance, Mark said, and hurrying handed each of his brother a calculator piece to replace. Upstairs, their mom's heels clicked on the kitchen floor as she put groceries away. Another sound, thump, 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 meant Major Nelson was bounding all around her, hoping for a treat. So focused were the boys on reassembly that they didn't realize the danger till they heard Mom's heels echoing on the wooden basement steps. By now, the boys had been in this predicament so often they knew the countdown. 3, Scott closed his eyes, prepared to accept his fate. 2, Mark made a last-ditch attempt to hide what they'd been doing, in the process yanking the newspaper off the workbench. 1, Mom appeared in the doorway just in time to see a scattering of tiny calculator parts bouncing every which way across the floor. Ignition. Boys, Mom cried, what in the heck have you done now? Chapter 2. After the calculator catastrophe, Scott and Mark estimated they'd be grounded for approximately 1 century, with maybe a decade off for good behavior. But that wasn't what happened. Instead, once the initial lecture was over, Mom and Dad took the whole thing surprisingly calmly. And the next day they announced they were packing the boys off to Grandpa Joe's for a week. Grandpa Joe McAvoy was their mom's dad, a widower who lived in a cabin by a lake about an hour's drive north by car, near the New York-New Jersey state line. "You mean, instead of punishing us, you're rewarding us?" Mark asked. "That doesn't make any sense," Scott said. "I mean, not that it's a bad idea, though." "It's an excellent idea," said Mark, "and we're really sorry about the calculator." "We told you all that already, right?" Scott asked. "You did," said Mr. Kelly. He wasn't smiling, but he wasn't yelling either. "Your mom and I think the trouble is you're bored around the house. Grandpa Joe has got plenty of work for you to do." "Our idea is you'll be so busy at Grandpa's you won't have time to get in trouble," Mom concluded. "Get it?" "Got it," said Mark and Scott. "Good," said their parents. The Kelly family lived in a friendly neighborhood in West Orange, New Jersey, only 15 miles from New York City. The Kellys' 2-story house was gray rock with white trim and very well kept because, as their dad put it, they were 2 healthy boys to serve as slave labor. Since Mr. and Mrs. Kelly both worked long hours at hard jobs, Mark and Scott mowed the lawn, mulched the flower beds, watered, and weeded. But the yard was small, so in the summer there was plenty of time left over for goofing around and getting bored. Mark and Scott were the only 2 kids in their family. Their parents said 2 were plenty when they were as rough and tumble as the twins. The boys were alike in many ways, good at sports, curious about everything, and fast learners when they wanted to be. But there were differences, too. Mark was inclined both to act first and speak first. He liked to tease his brother. There was trouble when he didn't get his way. Scott was more even-tempered and usually thought before speaking. He also had a good sense of humor about himself, which was kind of a requirement for getting along with his brother. The next day was Sunday. Mr. Kelly was a police officer who worked nights, so in the morning he drove the boys north to the family's Ford Country Squire station wagon with wood paneling on the side. The drive was mostly on the highway. The car had no air conditioning. The ride was hot and boring, and both boys fell asleep. When they woke up, it was because the car was bumping along the ruts of their grandfather's unpaved driveway. "Where's Grandpa Joe?" Mark asked after a few minutes later. He and Scott had dumped their duffel bags in twin territory, which is what they called the second-floor loft where they always slept. The house, as always, was unlocked. Grandpa said that if he wanted to lock his doors, he would have stayed in the city. "Search me," said Mr. Kelly. "I told him what time we'd be getting here, give or take." "Hello!" a voice called from the path leading to the shore of nearby Greenwood Lake. Scott, Mark, and their dad turned, and here came Grandpa, wearing denim overalls with no shirt underneath. Dad shook his head and laughed. "Ever the snappy dresser, Joseph." Grandpa tugged at the shoulder straps. "You like the Farmer John look, eh? Well, of course you do. Overalls provide all the ventilation you could want on a hot day. Plus, you can't beat 'em for comfort. Now, how are my outlaw grandsons?" Grandpa Joe had served in the Merchant Marine and later captained a fireboat in New York Harbor. Now, depending on the day of the week, he identified his occupation as either a farmer, architect, or mechanic. He was a farmer because he had a patch of vegetables planted behind his house and 2 hens whose eggs he could never find. He was an architect because he had designed and built his house himself, or more accurately, was working on designing and building it. Not all the rooms had walls, and parts of the roof were just blue tarp. And he was a mechanic because he had a rusted-out Model A pickup truck on blocks beside the house and a barn he used as a workshop out back. Brimming with tools, parts, bits, pieces, junk, discards, cobwebs, grease, and geejaws, the workshop was a source of endless fascination to the twins because, in part, they were never allowed to visit without strict supervision. Grandpa said he was afraid they might blow something up. Neither Dad nor Grandpa was a hugger, so the 2 shook hands and slapped backs and said, "Great to see you." Then they all went inside and rustled up bread, apples, and peanut butter for lunch. Peanut butter, in Grandpa's opinion, was the perfect food. They ate at a picnic table under a tree, and then Dad said he had to leave to get to work. "Be good, boys, and do what Grandpa tells you." "We will, Dad," said Mark. "We promise," said Scott. Chapter 3. Usually, Mark and Scott loved visiting their grandfather in the summertime, but this time they'd forgotten one thing. Grandpa didn't have TV. This wouldn't have mattered so much except their visit overlapped with the last few days of an important NASA mission, the one where space modules from the USA and Soviet Union met in orbit. On Thursday, Scott and Mark had watched the docking of the Apollo and Soyuz spacecraft. Then later they watched the astronauts and cosmonauts floating through the hatch and shaking hands. The Russian crew had returned to Earth already, but the 3 Americans wouldn't splash down till Thursday. TV would cover it live, and Mark and Scott didn't want to miss it. I don't see what the trouble is, their grandfather said. You can read all about it in the newspaper on Friday. The newspaper? Mark couldn't believe he was related to anyone so old-fashioned. That's nowhere as good as seeing it live on TV. Grandpa put his hand to his ear and said, that sound I hear couldn't be whining, could it? Mark sighed. No, sir, he said. Absolutely not. Even without television, the week passed quickly. As predicted, Grandpa found plenty for them to do, like washing windows, painting the porch, weeding the garden, and gathering the always elusive eggs. On the rare times that Grandpa didn't have a job for them, there were woods where they could wander and build forts, and a lake where they could row a boat and swim. Both boys were skillful tree climbers. Mark made a game out of climbing as high as he could. Scott liked to find a fat branch on which to sit and contemplate the world. Finally, it was Friday, the day the boys had been dreading. On Friday, a girl had been invited to come over and eat lunch. She's going into 6th grade like you are, and she's not icky or anything. You'll like her, Grandpa said. The boys couldn't believe it. Didn't Grandpa remember being a kid? Didn't he remember how uncool it was to hang out with a girl? How could he assume you'd get along with a total stranger, a female total stranger, just because she happened to be in the same grade as you? Mark had argued. Scott had sulked. But nothing worked, and at lunchtime, Jenny O'Malley arrived in a beat-up Ford Falcon with her mom and a homemade blueberry pie. Jenny had wavy brown hair and freckles. She was wearing cutoffs and a blue t-shirt and tennis shoes with no socks. She looked normal enough, and the pie was delicious. Jenny didn't say much while they ate, but her mom talked a lot, and Grandpa laughed at all the stuff she said. After lunch, Jenny's mom actually uttered these words. Now, you kids run along and play for a bit before we have to go home. Don't you want to get to know each other? Jenny looked appropriately mortified. Mark thought he would have died if his own mom had ever said anything that dumb. But Scott got up from the table and said, come on, without looking at anyone, and the 3 of them took off for the shore of the lake. Mark was more talkative than his brother, and he wasn't proud of this, cared more about what other people thought. So when they got to the lake shore, it was Mark who said, I liked that pie. Did you make it, or your mom? I did, Jenny said. My mom doesn't really cook. That makes you an engineer in a way, Mark said. You took the flour, water, butter, and blueberries, then you engineered a pie out of them. Jenny grinned. That's a good way to think about it. After that, they skipped stones on the water, and one of Jenny's bounced 5 times. Good one, Mark said. Jenny shrugged. I get a lot of practice. Then she put her hands in her pockets. You know, coming here today wasn't my idea. My mom said I had to. Yeah? Scott looked up. So that's okay then, Mark said. After that, it was easier to talk, and it turned out Jenny was interested in space stuff, too. The science teacher at her school, Mr. Drizzle, launched homemade rockets for fun. One time he told the class he was working on a new kind of rocket fuel, solid fuel, something more powerful and advanced than anything NASA had come up with. You mean he has a secret formula? Scott asked. Jenny nodded. I think that's exactly it. Then later another kid asked a question about it, and he said he shouldn't have brought it up in the first place, and we should all forget he mentioned it. So maybe we should forget about it too, Mark said. My lips are sealed, said Scott. Inspired by Mr. Drizzle, Jenny had followed the Apollo-Soyuz mission and watched the splashdown on TV the afternoon before. Lucky, Mark said. We read about it in the newspaper, Scott said. The astronauts almost died, Jenny said. Yeah, when that poison gas came in the spacecraft on re-entry. Nitrogen tetroxide propellant from the RCS, reaction control system. Jenny pronounced all of that like it was easy. They forgot to close a valve or something. Scott and Mark looked at each other, and then at Jenny, who had turned pink. Sorry, she said. My friends call me an egghead. Jenny the egghead, Scott said. Egg for short. Jenny! Jenny's mom appeared at the head of the path through the trees. She was walking with Grandpa. Oh, there you are. Time to go, honey. Did you have a nice time? I don't know, Mom. She looked at Mark and Scott. Did we have a nice time? The boys all cracked up, which Jenny's mom interpreted as yes. Told you so, she said to her daughter, and then to the boys. Come back later in the summer, why don't you? Maybe you kids can get together again. All right, I'm going to stop there for right now, and I'll post the next 3 chapters a little bit later.